just launch right in. I have no idea how long this lecture will go, but it's probably going to be about an hour and 15 minutes. So here's the point. The whole week last week was spent on behavior. We were talking about a specific kind of behavior, conflict behavior. Really, the last 2 weeks have kind of been spent talking about how couples interact. Sometimes there's things couples do to make the relationship better, and there's things couples do that make the relationship worse. And we talked about the research that addresses these issues. And all of that research rests on an assumption that we did not talk about. And the assumption that we did not talk about is that a behavior has a meaning that is inherent to the behavior. That there's things that you can do in a relationship that are either good for the relationship or bad for the relationship, and the goodness or badness lies inside the behavior. That assumption is crucial because I told you that in some of this research we have coders, maybe undergraduates like yourself, look at videotapes, watch a behavior and say, that was good. That was supportive. They're watching the behavior and saying, that behavior, supportive. If you say to somebody, I love your hair, that's a nice thing to do. But what I want to do this week is question that exact assumption. Question that exact assumption, the assumption that behaviors have inherent meanings. Because you can imagine that there are behaviors that are not, there's behaviors that could be positive for somebody, and the same exact behavior could be negative for somebody else. Don't believe me? Well, let me give you an example. One example, this is from one of my favorite films, Annie Hall, one of Woody Allen's classic film, won the Best Picture in 1977, I believe, or maybe 78. Have you seen the film, Annie Hall? Raise your hand. Oh, come now. Go rent it immediately. The point is that in the film, which is the story of a relationship that ultimately ends, there's points where there are interviews with the two people, one of whom is Woody Allen, the other of whom is Diane Keaton. And they're talking about their sex life. And they're parallel interviews. And so at one point, he says, she's so frigid. She's no interest in sex. We have only sex maybe 3 times a week. And she then, it cuts to her, and in her interview, she says, he's so demanding. We're constantly having sex like 3 times a week. And what's funny about that is that the behavior is the same behavior. They aren't, like a lot of couples that we've talked about in this class already, disagreeing about how much they have sex. But they're disagreeing about its meaning. They're saying that the meaning of it, one person says that the 3 times a week is a sign of how little sex they have. The other one says that 3 times a week is a sign of how much sex they have. Same behavior, totally different meanings. You see that a lot. Let me give you another example. Imagine that I say to somebody, you don't look fat. Most people say, I suppose that's a nice thing to say. Or somebody, hey, do I look fat in this? And I respond, no, you don't. You don't look fat. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean? Does it mean that I really think you don't look fat? Does it mean that I'm not even listening to you and I'm just reading the paper and I'm saying, yeah, you don't look fat. I'm just ignoring you. I'm dismissing you. Does it mean that I'm trying to appease you and I'll say whatever it takes to appease you regardless of my own opinion? What does it mean? Well, an outside observer may not know what it means to you, and that's what matters for the relationship. Meaning comes partly from the behavior, yes. I mean, the behavior has to happen, but the behaviors, the things that happen in relationships get interpreted. We make meaning, and part of the meaning comes from what we do with our observation, what we do with the experience. That's what we're going to be talking about this week. It's this process of making meaning in relationships. We sort of hit upon this before, and I want to draw an explicit connection between what we'll be talking about this week and some of the theories we've already been discussing in this course. The intimacy process model. You remember the intimacy process model? The question is, how is it that we feel validated, that we feel cared for, that we feel loved in our relationships? And as you recall, The intimacy process model talked a lot about behavior. It said intimacy is a behavioral process. So it started with one partner disclosing or expressing something, and then there's a response. Like you say, I don't like the way I look in this outfit, and there's a response. No, you look terrific in that outfit. And then there's a reaction. Do I feel understood, validated, and cared for? Now, if I describe the model that way, it sounds very behavioral. But an element of the model that's crucial, and will be especially crucial this week, is these issues of these interpretive filters that come between the behavior and the response. A behavior, the meaning of this behavior, the impact of a behavior on promoting intimacy in a relationship is not inherent to the behavior. There are probably behaviors that are better or worse than others, of course. But any behavior, good or bad, has to pass through a lens. And this lens is the process of making meaning from that behavior. So if you say, you know, I don't feel like I look good in this outfit. And I say, well, trust me, you look fantastic in that outfit. Well, first of all, my reaction to your disclosure of not feeling good depends on my filter. And my filter is affected by my motives, goals, needs, and fears. Maybe, and we talked about attachment style, maybe I'm uncomfortable with dependence. I'm sensitive to dependence. So when you say, when you express a self-doubt, that irritates me. I'm like, oh, suddenly you're needy now? Suddenly I got to take care of you? No, thank you. And that's going to affect my response. Maybe I'm very comfortable with interdependence. Maybe I love being needed. I want to take care of you. That's going to affect a different response, even if your behavior is the same in both cases. And the same thing here. So I say, hey, you look great. Actually, I think you look great. You can imagine there's another interpretive filter here, another process of meaning making affected by your motives, needs, goals, and fears. If I say you look great, you might say, oh, your self-esteem might be low. You're like, I'm sure you're just saying that to appease me. You couldn't possibly believe that I really look great. Maybe you're quite secure, in which case you're like, hey, thank you. That's just what I wanted to hear. I just was just checking. Yeah, I do look pretty fantastic. The intimacy process model depends on what makes it a process is not just the exchange of behaviors, but the interplay of meaning making between partners. This is going on all the time in our relationships. We didn't really talk about it the last couple of weeks. We were talking about the behaviors themselves. But this isn't just frosting on top of the behavior. This is an integral part of how behaviors play themselves out and the implications that they have in our relationships. Well, then, what informs our meaning making? This week, we'll be spending 2 lectures on this topic because there's 2 whole chapters of our book on this topic. Today, I want to talk about the effect of the kind of knowledge we already have about relationships. And then on Friday, we'll talk about the sort of meaning-making process a little bit more. But today, I want to talk about how our understanding of what goes on in our relationship is affected by what we know about relationships. And to that extent, there are 3 levels of relationship knowledge. There's 3 kinds of knowledge that we have about relationships. And it's interesting to sort of think about it. We've got general beliefs and values about social behavior, regarding social behavior. And different people are going to have different beliefs about social behavior. An example, look out for number 1. So maybe I believe that everybody is basically self-interested in life. That would be a belief that you might have about social behavior. Another belief you might have about social behavior is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That would be another sort of general belief about social behavior that applies to all social behavior. And that's sort of the way you approach the social world, based on your general knowledge of how people function. Maybe you think, people are scum. Maybe you're you believe that life is nasty, brutish, and short. People are fundamentally uncivilized, and society sort of tamps down our base impulses. But at heart, we're uncivilized, we're selfish. Maybe that's what you believe. Maybe you believe differently. Maybe you believe people are basically good. And sure, there's sometimes we have conflicts, we have a difference of opinion, but at heart, we're human beings have evolved, good qualities, charitable qualities. This general knowledge is going to affect how you approach relationships in particular, and we have general knowledge and relationships about, we have general knowledge about relationships specifically too. So there's sort of knowledge about social behavior, then there's knowledge about intimate relationships. What I'm talking about here is we have beliefs about how intimate relationships are supposed to work. And my beliefs may be different from your beliefs, but we all have them. So I might ask you, how are people supposed to feel in their relationships? What does love mean? What does it mean? How are people supposed to look when they're in love with somebody else? How are people supposed to behave when they're in love with somebody else? This is still general beliefs and values. This is still general knowledge about what relationships are like in the world. But your general knowledge may be different from mine. And then working even more specific from knowledge, our knowledge about relationships, our knowledge about social behavior, to our knowledge about intimate relationships, we also have our specific beliefs about our own relationship. How does your relationship work? You can imagine a difference here. You can imagine that I might say, oh, relationships work in this way. Like, when people are in love, they hold hands and they gaze at each other when they walk along the path. And then I might say, okay, if that's how intimate relationships work when people are in love, tell me about your relationship. Oh, our relationship isn't like that. We don't have that kind of relationship. Oh, well, if you believe that love is about holding hands and gazing at each other, and you also believe that your relationship doesn't have that, well, then we know something about the kind of meaning that that you are making. And we can make some predictions that if your specific beliefs don't match up well with your general beliefs about what's nice, well, you're not going to be happy with your relationship. And that's the way thinking about cognition and relationship often proceeds. We sort of think, well, what does this knowledge do for us? By the way, I did post these slides 30 seconds before I left my office. So they are posted online, but none of you have probably printed them. So what functions does this knowledge serve? What does it do for us? How does it work to know things about relationships in advance of our experiences of relationships? See, because this knowledge is kind of unique. The thing about intimate relationships is that we know something about it before we ever experience it. Since we grow up surrounded by intimate relationships, since intimate relationships are such a fundamental part of everything that we see in media, everything that we read in stories, listen to in pop songs, we have all this knowledge in our heads, even if we've never had an intimate relationship ourselves. And then we have our own relationships, and that knowledge is added to that. So what does it do? Well, it does three specific things. There's three things that our advanced knowledge, our existing stable knowledge about relationships does for us. One thing, it helps to understand and explain the world. So I draw on my beliefs, my own theories about relationships, when I try to explain other people. Oh, why are they unhappy? Well, a lot of times if I look at somebody else and I say, oh, that's a bad relationship, I'm basing that judgment on my own knowledge of what a good relationship is all about. So we draw on our knowledge to explain the world around us. We also, and this is different, we also use our knowledge to anticipate and predict what will happen. That's important. That's an important part of navigating the social world. I want to know, well, is this a relationship that's likely to succeed or fail? Somebody else's or my own? This is especially useful, for example, in the realm of forming relationships. If I'm contemplating a potential relationship partner, I want to know, if I enter a relationship with this person, is it likely to be a good relationship, a fulfilling one? On what basis am I going to make that judgment? On the basis of my existing knowledge about relationships. Given what I think I know about what makes for good relationships, I'm going to choose one person over another person. Because I'm going to use my knowledge to predict a relationship with one person is going to be better than a relationship with another person. So this knowledge suddenly becomes really important. And the third reason it's important is we use our knowledge to control and regulate our behavior. In the examples that we were talking about at the beginning, if my partner asks me a question, how do I look in this? I use my knowledge about relationships, both my general knowledge about relationships and my specific knowledge about this relationship to guide my answer. Right? If I know, okay, so imagine the situation. You've just been asked, how do I look in this? And now you've got to answer. Well, your knowledge is going to affect your answer. It's going to control and regulate your behavior. If you know what you know about your partner and how relationships work, you might say, let's see, people like to be complimented, so even though I don't think you look good in that at all, and I think it's a terrible choice of clothing, I know, my knowledge is that people don't actually want an honest answer here, so that's going to shape my behavior, and I'm going to say one thing. On the other hand, if you're drawing on different knowledge, which is, well, the basis of a relationship is honesty. If I don't have honesty, I've got nothing. So maybe that's going to affect my behavior. The point being simply that our predictions, our behavior, our understanding is all shaped hugely by the knowledge we bring to each relationship and each experience. It so happens that the relationship between predictions and our own behavior is especially important. It comes up a lot. And it comes up explicitly in something that's been called the ideal standards model. This is sort of an interesting and influential theory that relates our cognitions, our thoughts, to how relationships go. And I'm going to go over it in some detail because it's really worth thinking about. Basically, this perspective says we are constantly asking ourselves, are we in a good or a bad relationship? That's a relevant question, and it is a relevant question that people ask themselves all the time. You ask yourself this at the very beginning of a relationship. Hey, we've just gone out on a date, one date. Was that a good date or a bad date? Is this a person that I want to see again, or do I want to say, yeah, I'll call you? It's relevant if you've been dating someone a long time. Hey, are we going to escalate our commitment or not? Well, I want to know, is this a good relationship? Is it worth escalating my commitment or not? It's important in a long-term marriage. Wow. We're going through a hard time. Is this a relationship worth pressing through the hard time or not? This is a question we constantly ask. The ideal standards model says, to answer it, we compare what we perceive we have, our perceptions of the moment. We compare it with pre-existing beliefs and values. Basically, we compare it to our ideals and our standards. So, if I say, well, is this a good relationship or not? I first of all say, well, what's going on in the relationship? What do I have? I say, well, let's see. We go out this much, we have sex this much, we fight this much, I'm having this good a time, these are the costs, these are the rewards. You sort of take stock. But to decide whether that is enough or not, you compare it. You compare it to my pre-existing beliefs or values. In other words, your values were, well, what do I need? What do I want from a relationship? What are my standards? And that standard is your existing knowledge. Now, if this all sounds mighty familiar to you, it should, because this is the idea of comparison level that we took from social exchange theory. The ideal standards model is essentially a more specific restatement of the fundamental ideas from social exchange theory, that to determine how satisfied we are, we compare our outcomes to our comparison level. What the ideal standards model does is it says our comparison level is essentially just what are our standards? And your standards may be different from mine. The premise of this model is this. If I get more than I expect, if the comparison between what I perceive I have and my standards, my beliefs and values, if that comparison is positive, happy. If that comparison is negative, less happy. And the implication of this, which we talked about a little bit when we talked about social exchange theory, is a particular level of outcomes has no inherent meaning. We give it meaning by comparing it to whatever our personal standards are. An example of research on this. Fletcher and Kinnenmuth, 1992, is an old study, but a pretty good study, which is, the question they're asking is, the question is, how closely related is sexual satisfaction and relationship satisfaction? How important is it? How can you be happy in a relationship if you're not happy with your sex life? Or if you're happy with your sex life, does that mean you're automatically happy with your relationship? That's the question, is the relationship between sexual satisfaction, relationship satisfaction. And what they found is it depended on your standards. It depended on what your ideals were for relationships in general. So here's how they study it. They ask people, basically, they give people a questionnaire and ask people, on a scale of 1 to 7, how important is this standard to you? And you can imagine some standards. It's important to me to have honest, open communication in relationships. The ideal standards model says the ideals are independent of any one relationship. These are values that you have across relationships. It's just a value that you have. It has nothing to do with your current relationship. It's just saying, in relationships, this is what matters to me, not fighting. In relationships, this is what matters to me, open communication. This is a standard that I have. Well, the question they asked here is, how important is a good sex life to you? How important is that for a good relationship to you? I'm not asking about this relationship. I'm just saying, in relationships generally, what's your standard with respect to sex? Now, what they found, totally consistent with this comparison level idea, is that people who said, sex is an important standard for me, you have to meet that, like sex is part of my ideal for a good relationship. When people said that's true, then their rating of their sex life correlated with their rating of their relationship 0.48. On a scale from 0 to 1, 0.48 is considered a very strong correlation. If sex is important to you, then it's highly related to your overall relationship with the relationship, your overall satisfaction with the relationship. But some people didn't say that. Some people had different standards. Some people said, sex is not important. A relationship's about more than just sex. It's about all sorts of things. Companionship, support, communication. And for those people, their ratings of their sex life correlated with satisfaction with the relationship as a whole, 0.04. When you think about correlation, that's an enormous difference, actually. And that's the whole point of the ideal standards model, is that, to use a statistical term, our ideals moderate the effect of a particular outcome on our satisfaction. Put another way, our ideals shape how we react to the specific experiences of the relationship. If our specific experiences are consistent with our ideals, we're happy. If our specific experiences are inconsistent with our ideals, we're not going to be so happy. And then what makes it interesting is, because different people have different ideals and different standards for relationships, the same behaviors are going to have different effects for different people. Well, how does this play out? One of the ways this plays out is in clinical settings. Clinical settings says, if that's true, a question? Is there a question?
Yeah.
What's your name?
My name is Dana.
Dana.
I don't know if you're already going into this, but so according to that model, it seems as though the higher your standards, then the less satisfied or less happy you're going to be. And so my question is, are there ways of testing if your standards are too high?
I'm so going to get at this, Dana.
Okay,
Listen, I only wish I'd been able to post the slides earlier, because you'd be looking ahead saying, oh, he's going to get to this. And if I don't get to it, you and I were going to talk in front of these people in a moment. Okay, so the point is this. But Dana intuits. She goes, well, wait a minute. If this is true, then what are good standards to have? Are there some standards that are better than others? I think it's part of Dana's issue. And indeed, clinical people said, look, if standards shape how we react to specific experiences, because we're comparing our experiences to our standards, then there may well be standards that are bad for us, or beliefs about relationships that do us no good. And indeed, Adelson and Epstein identified a set of standards. These are 4 of them. They actually had 5, but I'm going to talk about these 4, that they called destructive beliefs, dysfunctional beliefs about relationships. And I'm going to go through them, and what I want you to ask yourself, what makes this dysfunctional? And in each case, it's just a matter of applying the ideal standards model. Okay? So these are clinicians now who said these are beliefs that are just not good for relationships. David, do you have a question? Okay, hold on. Their first dysfunctional belief is this: disagreement is destructive. So they had a questionnaire to measure this belief, and one of the items on that questionnaire is, when my partner and I fight, I feel like I'm dying inside. When my partner and I fight, it causes me to lose hope in the relationship. Another part of this dysfunctional belief is the sort of general level, which is when partners can't communicate, it means they're in a bad relationship. Or if partners are arguing, it means they're in a bad relationship. Disagreement is destructive. No, well, why is that dysfunctional belief? Because, as we were saying last week, some disagreement is inevitable. People will disagree in their relationships. So if you have a disagreement and you believe that disagreement is destructive, how will that shape your reaction? Well, it means that you're going to be more nervous, more anxious, more defensive. Oh no, we're disagreeing. If I believe that disagreement is destructive, then disagreement is going to be a very bad day for me. In contrast, some people didn't agree with this. Some people said, hey, a little disagreement is part of every relationship. It's natural that intimate partners will disagree. That would be the opposite belief. Well, now if you've got that belief, what happens when you have an argument? Like, oh, we're having an argument, we disagree. Sure, of course we are, because we're intimate. It's a natural part of intimacy. You'll be more calm, less defensive. The same argument, but your belief shapes your reaction to it. A second dysfunctional belief: mind reading is expected. An example of an item that people agreed with when they agreed with this dysfunctional belief was something like, intimate partners should know what each other is thinking without having to communicate in words. Now, admit it, you've heard people say this. Like, oh, this is such a good relationship, I just look at her and I know what she's thinking. And that's what a good relationship is all about, isn't it? Just know. Or how about this one? Look, I can tell you what I'm thinking, but I shouldn't have to. You should just know. You should know me so well. We should be so close that you should just know that I'm incredibly pissed off right now. Well, mind reading is expected. If you really believe this, if you believe that in a good relationship people should read each other's minds without speaking, then what happens when you don't know what the other person's thinking? Uh-oh, maybe we're not in a good relationship. Or also, what happens when there's an opportunity to communicate honestly, openly, and directly? Well, why bother? Mind reading is expected. And of course, that's a problem, because it means you're not going to be working on open communication. It means that if you miscommunicate, it's being considered, oh no, then I haven't read your mind. There must be something wrong with our relationship. In contrast, people who disagree with mind reading is expected are the people who say, the only way for people to know each other is through communication. Talking honestly and directly is the only way to get closer to another person. And if you believe that, it'll guide your behavior. You're more likely to actually engage in that kind of communication. Which turns out to be a good thing. Sexual perfectionism. Again, you sort of get the pattern here. People who agree with this nexus of beliefs agree with the statement, it's very important to me that I satisfy my partner sexually every time we have sex. Another one is something like, every time we have sex, it's got to be a romantic, perfect, fulfilling fireworks experience. Well, if that's your life, good for you. But if it isn't perfect every single time, how do you react? Well, if you score high in sexual perfectionism, then the failure to have a perfect fireworks experience each moment is a big deal. Oh no! What does that mean? Does that mean we're in a bad relationship? The knowledge, the belief, shapes your reaction to the experience. In contrast, if you disagree with sexual perfectionism, if you're sort of saying, well, sometimes we'll have good sex, sometimes it won't be our night, then if it's not your night, your reaction is going to be more moderate. It's less of a catastrophe. A fourth dysfunctional belief is the idea that men and women are basically different. The sort of belief that, and people who agree with that endorse statements like, men and women have totally different ways of communicating. Well, if you believe it, men and women have totally different ways of communicating. If you've read the book Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, and you believe it, it kind of lowers your motivation to try to understand your partner if your partner is of the opposite sex. Because you've been told, you believe, look, there's a distance between us that there's no point bridging that distance because we're fundamentally on different planets. How does that affect your motivation to actually try to connect with your partner? It lowers your motivation to try to connect with your partner. In contrast, if you reject this idea, like actually men and women aren't basically different, there are no inherent differences between men and women that would prevent communication, then that would raise your motivation to try to communicate with your partner should you have an opposite sex partner. I went through this basically to point out that how the ideal standards model is applied. Over and over again, for each of these beliefs, the idea is the same, which is our beliefs will modify our reactions to specific experiences. We have a specific experience, and the nature of our beliefs modifies it. And so Dana points out, well, I'll still get to that. I mean, by the end, we will get to Dana's issue, which is, what's the implication here? What's a healthy way to believe? What are healthy beliefs? We'll get there. These beliefs seem to be unhealthy. Why? What makes these beliefs unhealthy as a whole is that they are unrealistic. If you have these beliefs, you are likely to be disappointed. And disappointment doesn't feel good. So far, we've talked about how our beliefs about relationships modify our reactions to specific things that happen in the relationship. But that's not the only effect we could see. Oh wait, no, I have more of this. So this is still more. So this is now another slide making a similar point. And we talked about dysfunctional beliefs in the previous slide. Another set of beliefs that have been studied a great deal in the same way that function as ideals that we compare our experiences to is the idea of implicit theories of relationships. And let me ask you, which statement do you agree with more? Relationships that do not start off well will fail, versus people can change the way they act. I'm not going to ask you, I'm not going to take a show of hands, but this first statement is part of a nexus of beliefs that people have that have been studied a great deal, especially in college students, which gets at the idea that some people think that relationships are kind of fixed. A relationship either is good or it isn't. And either you're destined to be together, you found your soulmate, or you're not destined to be together. And that's a language that I think some of us are at least familiar with, which is, you know what? It's just not meant to be. I'm not feeling it. This relationship just ain't working because it's not meant to be. All of those ideas are consistent with sort of a network of beliefs which are called implicit theories of relationships. What makes it an implicit theory is we're not talking about some idea that people have that they've written down. It's not like Darwin said, oh, here's my theory of relationships. I mean, I have a theory of relationships that I've written down, but most people haven't. It's implicit. It's a theory that people have in their heads even though they haven't articulated it explicitly. And one theory is the theory that relationships are these fixed entities that either work or they don't. And there are people who will endorse this theory, who will say, I agree with that. A second theory is the theory that people can change and that relationships can change if you work hard enough. So the second sort of network of beliefs is the idea that relationships need work, and with work, you can make them successful. You can get someone to change if you don't like their behavior through a lot of hard work, therapy, communication, or what have you. You see the difference. It sort of says relationships are fixed, relationships are malleable. Relationships are fated, relationships are something you work on. And a fellow by the name of C. Raymond Nee, he goes by Chip, if you ever meet him. He's at the University of Houston, and he's a friend of mine, and he studies this. He measures these, and how much people endorse these two theories. And what he finds is that the extent to which you believe one of these theories versus the other has a lot of implications for how you react to what goes on in the relationship. Much the way we've been talking for quite a few minutes now. So for example, he asks a question, how important are your perceptions of your partner's personality to your satisfaction? So what he asks, what he does is brings people into a room, asks people, tell me about your partner. Tell me about your partner's strengths, weaknesses, tell me about your partner's character. And most people, if you ask them, will say, oh, my partner has many, many strengths if they're in a happy relationship, and also some weaknesses. And some people see more weaknesses than others. But the question is, how important are those perceptions to your feelings of satisfaction in the relationship? And what he finds is, it depends on your theory. If you think that people can change, that people can grow and change and evolve, then your perceptions of your partner's personality are less linked to your satisfaction in the relationship. Because like, oh, my partner has some flaws, but they're growing. They're changing, we can work on it. It's still a good relationship. On the other hand, if you think people can't change, people are people. People don't change, they are who they are. In that case, and for those people, perceptions of partner's personality were strongly linked to relationship satisfaction. The belief changed the relationship between your experience and your relationship satisfaction. Chip did another study. How much is initial satisfaction linked to relationship longevity? This is an interesting question. The question he asked here, to put another way, is when the relationship begins, or at the beginning of this is college dating relationships, how important is satisfaction? Now, we know that in general, more people who are more satisfied in a relationship stay together longer, in general. But what he found was that that relationship, the relationship between how happy you are at the beginning of the relationship and how long the relationship stays together, that association is shaped by people's theories of relationships. If you believe that relationships are fated, our relationships are a matter of chemistry and fate, and they either work or they don't, and there's nothing you can do about it. If you believe that, then your initial satisfaction is powerfully linked to how long the relationship stays together. If you're happy, you're like, oh, this is it, fate, soulmate time, and you stay together. Those people who believe in that sort of fixed fate theory, if you're not happy at the beginning, you get out quickly. You're like, this isn't working, it's never going to work. In contrast, people who believe that relationships are a function of working at it, for them, this relationship is much weaker. If you believe that a relationship can grow, can evolve, that people can change, and that you can improve your relationship through the effort that you put into your relationship, if you agree relationships take work, then your initial satisfaction is less strongly associated with how long the relationship ends. Because you might say, even if we're not so happy now, we can get better. We can work it out. So this is another example of the sort of general principle that carries us a lot. It carries us a long way, this principle, to understand both our own relationships, the relationships of our partners, or the reactions of our partners, and other people's relationships. You'll see friends who are in relationships that you think suck. Let me tell you what's going to happen also, which is that you're going to see your friends marrying people of whom you do not approve. How can that be? How is it that your friends are failing to observe that the people that they are happily marrying are totally unsuitable when it seems so clear to you? Well, one answer to that question is that you are applying different knowledge than your friend is. You're comparing that behavior to your own standard. Your friend is comparing those behaviors to a different standard. So this process, this ideal standards model way of thinking comes up a lot. But it's not the only way to think about the effects of our relationship knowledge on relationship outcomes. Because so far, everything that we've said suggests that our knowledge is kind of reacting to our experiences. The statistical term is it moderates our reactions to our experiences. But that's not the only possibility. Not at all. It's also possible that our knowledge shapes our experiences. Our knowledge actually changes the experience, which in statistical terms would be a mediating relationship. A mediating relationship if you're statistically inclined. It's not just that our knowledge affects our reactions, but it actually affects how we perceive the experience. Our expectations, for example. One type of knowledge that we have are expectations. This would be specific knowledge. What do you think is going to happen in your relationship? I can ask you this. Well, what do you think is going to happen? We've defined, or psychologists define expectations as your basic predictions on what kind of things you can expect to happen. And sometimes you're surprised. It so happens that our expectations for our relationships and for everything else affect not only how we react to what we perceive, but actually what we perceive itself. And we tend to see what we expect to see. Let me give you an example. A colleague of mine named Geraldine Downey, she's at Columbia University, studies a construct called rejection sensitivity. Rejection sensitivity is essentially a belief about yourself. Well, it's a personality trait that describes people who are worried about being rejected a lot. In other words, they're sensitive to the possibility that they will be rejected. And some people, if you give people like an inventory of rejection sensitivity, some people score high. They're vigilant to signs of rejection, and they're prone to seeing signs of rejection. People who score low are not vigilant, they're not worried about being rejected, they're pretty confident that people will accept them. Geraldine Downey has looked at the effects of rejection sensitivity, which is basically a set of knowledge. It's an expectation that you will be rejected. If you score high, you expect that you'll be rejected. And what she's found is people who score high in this, not only are they sensitive to rejection, but they're actually more likely to perceive rejection even when none exists. Let me give you an example. She brings people to the lab, and people who score either high or low in rejection sensitivity. And then she gives them a hypothetical scenario. No. Excuse me, she doesn't give them a hypothetical scenario. She gives them a real scenario. What she says is this. It's a really clever study. She says, hi, you will be working in our study with a partner, and here's your partner. And the partner is a confederate of the researcher. So they're sitting next to each other in their chairs, and they say, okay, you're going to be working closely together, and we're going to start the study in about 2 minutes, so just take a break. During those 2 minutes, very quickly, the confederate says, steps out for a moment, and then the researcher comes back and says, sorry, the confederate had to go. So we won't be able to do that part of the teamwork part of the study. We'll do this other part of the study instead. And one of the questions is, how does the real subject, why do they think the confederate has to go? And how do they feel about it? Now, if you are low in rejection sensitivity, you do not expect that people will reject you. Why did the confederate have to go? Why? If you're a confident person, you're low in rejection sensitivity, what are possible reasons why this confederate suddenly stepped out and didn't come back? They felt sick. They got sick. Oh, my cell phone rang. My wife's going into labor. Something like that. There's plenty of reasons. There was nothing in the scenario, nothing that implied, that directly implied rejection of the real subject. And indeed, the real subjects who were low in rejection sensitivity perceived no rejection at all. Thus, their mood was not affected. Nothing was affected. But, as you might imagine, the people who were high in rejection sensitivity felt that the confederate had left because they didn't want to work with them personally. They took it personally, and they perceived the confederate's absence as a rejection. They perceived rejection where there was no rejection. because their expectations affected their perceptions. So suddenly these people had a rejection experience, even though someone else in the same chair wouldn't have had no rejection experience. The perception, the expectation affected the experience, created, in a way, the experience. Danielle?
Two questions. So that's essentially like the self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
Yes, it's 100% a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Second, can you just repeat again the difference between moderate and mediate? Because I feel like it's kind of the same thing. So you're saying one, with moderate, it seems like it changes how we react to experiences?
Yes. I would rather actually, I'd rather not get into that actually. Because basically the idea, the quickest way I can say it, the simplest way I can say it is, so far in the class, we've been talking about how an experience exists and our reaction to it is shaped by how we think about it. Here we're saying that our expectation actually creates the experience, causes the experience. David?
To what extent do people who score high in rejection sensitivity have low mate value?
Have low mate value? You mean, I think you're saying, to what extent do people who score high in rejection sensitivity, to what extent are they right to be sensitive because they actually, are ugly or unattractive or unappealing mates? I don't know. It's a good question, though. I don't know. It's worth looking up. You see the point, though. Any other questions about that particular example? It's an example where the sensitivity creates the perception. It doesn't just react to the perception, it actually creates the perception where otherwise there would be no perception. Yes, in the back. Tell me it. Tasia. They got around that. I don't remember the details of the study. But they got around it. It's a good point. It seems a little suspicious that the person walked out. Now I'm saying, oh, and by the way, why do you think that person walked out? Did you think it has something to do with you? They didn't do it that way. They found some good cover story to get out of it, but I don't remember the cover story. Is it Hugo?
It's Robbie.
Hi, Robbie.
Yeah, hey. Will the opinion or the perception of the subject matter whether the competitor was attractive or not, or did it matter?
It didn't matter. The confederate was always the same thing. The confederate was held constant. So the confederate was always the same attractiveness because it was the same confederate every time. So
Was she attractive?
I don't know. But I assume there was sort of chosen to be someone who was moderately everything. But it doesn't matter because no matter whether this person was high in rejection sensitivity or low in rejection sensitivity, the confederate was always the same person. Other questions? So you get the point. I can give you another example. I don't want to belabor the point, but low self-esteem has the same effects. What does it mean to have low self-esteem? It means that you don't feel good about yourself. You don't have a sense of your own worth. You don't feel like you're a person of value. Well, in relationships, my colleague Sandra Murray over at SUNY Buffalo has looked a lot about the effects of low self-esteem on how people interpret their partner's behavior. And what happens is people who have low self-esteem think they perceive their partners as liking them less than their partners actually like them. So here's how she studied this. She gets couples where one partner has low self-esteem. But she brings the couple into the research rooms. And she asks each one, tell me about your partner. Tell me about your partner's strengths. Tell me about your partner's weaknesses. And tell me, how much do you love or like your partner? People who have low self-esteem consistently underestimate how well their partner views them. So now I'm not asking you, so low self-esteem person, I'm not asking you now to tell me about yourself. I've already got that information. I want to know, what do you think your partner thinks of you? And I've also asked the partner, what do you actually think of the person? And I can compare them. And what Murray finds is that when I have low self-esteem, I actually perceive my partner wrong. Now I'm not reacting to something. It's the self-esteem, the knowledge base, is generating the perception that my partner doesn't like me that much, even though my partner likes me fine. This is what we call perceptual confirmation. If I expect that someone's not going to like me, I perceive that they don't like me, even if that's not the case. If I expect that I'm going to be rejected, I perceive that I've been rejected, even if I haven't. We see what we expect to see, which makes those expectations really important. What we expect to have happen to us is in many ways going to shape our relationship through this perceptual process. But not only this perceptual process, there's another process, behavioral confirmation. So we've said our expectations affect what we see. We see what we expect to see. In relationships, our expectations also affect our behavior. And this is sort of more typically what's been called the self-fulfilling prophecy. But they're both, in a way, self-fulfilling prophecies. With the idea being that if I think, well, I'll just give you a great example. The self-fulfilling prophecy is simply this, that my expectation shapes how I treat people. If I expect you're going to be nice to me, then I think, oh, you're going to be nice to me, so it's safe for me to treat you in a very nice, open, friendly way. There's nothing to fear here. But if I treat you in a nice, open, friendly way, you're more likely to be nice to me, confirming my expectation through this behavioral process. My behavior has has been the mediator through which I've confirmed the expectation. That's how a quantitative person would say. So then again, there's been a number of studies that have made this point, that wow, our expectations actually change how we behave. Not so much how we react now, but change our behavior. So for example, this is a great study, talked about a lot in the textbook. How do we interact with people we think are attractive? There's a lot of research that shows that attractive people tend to be more comfortable in social situations. Why would that be true? Well, one reason is that we expect them to be comfortable in social situations. And to study this, some researchers, Snyder, Tanke, and Burchide, were the ones who did it. Doesn't matter, though. Here's what they did, very clever. It's an old study from the 70s. There's lots of ways you could do it online now, but what they did in the 70s is they had men talking to women on the phone. And they recorded the woman's side and the men's side separately. And they had raters rate how warm, how friendly, how jovial each partner was in the conversation. Here's the manipulation. Obvious manipulation, right? They gave the man one of two photos. They said, here's the woman you're about to have a phone conversation with. And one of the photos was of a very attractive woman, and one of the photos was of a less attractive woman, significantly less attractive woman. Well, as you might imagine, the men who thought they were talking to an attractive woman were a lot more engaged. They were a lot more warm. They were a lot more flirtatious. They were a lot more inviting. They were more interested in the interaction for reasons that are not so surprising. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part, in my view, is that when observers listened to just the woman's side of the conversation, they couldn't hear the men's side. All they could hear was the women. The women who did not know that they were in an experiment of this type, did not know that the men had been given a false picture of them. They were just being themselves. But the women who were talking to men who thought they were attractive were themselves rated as more friendly, more warm, more sociable, more socially skilled than women who were talking to men who thought they were unattractive. The men, in other words, were actually drawing out of their interaction partners the behaviors that they expected to see. That's powerful. That's behavioral confirmation. The issue here isn't that the men perceived their partners to be more attractive, although they may well have. But that when they expected, because of the picture, that their partners would be more friendly and social, they actually got more friendly and social partners. Now, how does this play out in the digital age? Well, a lot of times nowadays, we may have opportunities to interact with people online who we don't see. But if we want people to treat us well, what are some strategies for doing it? Well, perhaps we post a little picture of ourselves, and maybe it's not really a picture of ourselves at all, but a picture of somebody else who's much more attractive than ourselves. Or maybe why would my online name, why would my email name be like cute pixie at UCLA? Which I actually get emails from students who are like, Dr. Cohn, I have something very important to say. And then the emails from like, you know, like hot sorority chick at UCLA. Like, what? That's not a professional name. Why did you choose that name? Why did you choose that name? Because people are saying, oh, I think that if I give you some kind of cue, I'm giving you an expectation and hoping that you'll treat me accordingly. Of course, you know, you may find yourself, I mean, with the internet, it's possible to actually manipulate the expectation entirely so that you can pretend to be someone you absolutely are not. And you know, this is a common thing on the internet, where you find yourself interacting with someone who says, oh yes, I'm a fantastically successful, gorgeous accountant who has a condominium in Tuscany. But maybe that's true, maybe it isn't. But certainly, it's a way of manipulating expectations so you can benefit from behavioral confirmation. So that's the good side. The downside is depressed people. We've talked in the past in this course about how people who are depressed have challenges socially and have challenges in their relationship. Depression is a very toxic thing for successful intimate relationships. Behavioral confirmation is one reason why this is true. A researcher named Jim Coyne has done some excellent work on this topic, looking at how do depressed people treat others. And what they find is that depressed people who expect to be rejected treat others in ways that promote them getting rejected. Essentially, depressed people behave in ways that others find annoying, and so are more likely to get rejected. So, for example, one behavior that is common in depressed people is something called excessive reassurance seeking. You know what excessive reassurance seeking is? It's when you don't just say, do I look fat in this? But you say, no, really. You hate it, right? Oh, no, you hate it. I know you hate it. Oh, I knew it. You totally hate it. You don't hate it? Are you sure you don't hate it? You know what? I hate it. Now shut up. In some of our research, we saw that this was a problem for some couples. This is a newlywed couple, I remember, and we asked them, we were videotaping them talking about an issue in the relationship. And the issue that they were talking about in the relationship was how they have trouble making decisions. They have trouble making decisions. Okay. And then we watched the videotape, and here's what we saw. What we saw was basically the husband had a history of depression. And because of his history of depression, he never believed anything that his wife said when there was time to make a decision. So, and it became a big deal for him. So he's like, okay, so every time we want to go out to eat, the challenge is for me to believe that you're not just choosing Chinese because you know I like Chinese, but that you really do like Chinese. Because you'd tell me if you weren't in the mood for Chinese, right? Right? She's like, yes, I would totally tell you if I wasn't in the mood for Chinese. I don't actually care that much. And he goes, I know you don't care because you love me. And you'd go out for Chinese even if you didn't like it, right? She goes, yes, but I'm not doing it just to love you. I don't really care where we go out. He goes, yes, but I just want you to be happy. She goes, yes, well, I am happy. It's nothing to do with whether or not we go out to Chinese. She goes, exactly. So it doesn't matter, right? But I might as well make you happy, right? Anyway, it went on like that for 10 minutes. And the point is that he was very, very worried that no matter what he did, he'd be disappointing her. And in obsessing about it and inflicting his obsessions on her, of course, he did end up irritating her in exactly the ways he was afraid of. And there's a poignancy here. There's a poignancy and sort of almost a tragedy in the processes of behavioral confirmation, because people can bring about what they fear most. Well, that's sad. That depressed fellow trying to choose where to go out to eat, all he wanted to do was make his wife happy. And he was so worried, so nervous and anxious that he would disappoint her. Unfortunately, his anxieties were so powerful and they shaped his behavior so much that he ended up disappointing and frustrating and irritating her in exactly the ways he was trying to avoid. Well, that's the downside of behavioral confirmation. If you expect the worst, you might behave in ways that bring it about. And that brings us back to Dana. When we talked about the moderating effects, the ideal standards model, there was an implication there that Dana immediately picked up on, which is, well, if I have high standards, I'm likely to be disappointed. The higher my standards, the more room there is for me to be disappointed. Doesn't that mean, Dana was sort of saying, that I should lower my standards? Less room for disappointment. But this stuff, this behavioral and perceptual confirmation stuff says, wait a minute, if I get what I expect to get, shouldn't I expect the moon? Shouldn't I expect the most? The higher my expectations, the more I will, through behavioral processes and perceptual processes, get what I expect. So shouldn't I have high expectations? Well, this is the issue. Which is better? So we've just explained the argument for higher standards has to do with these confirmation processes. Maybe I want to really expect the best, and then you achieve it. And a lot of sort of personal success gurus make this point. Shoot for the moon. Aim high. Dream big. That's the only way that you can actually achieve what you dream. So you should do that in your relationships. Have high standards, and if you expect people will love you, well, darn it, people will find you more lovable and indeed love you. The expectation, but there's another argument, which is, well, wait a minute. You don't want to have high expectations. Just setting yourself up for disappointment. Disappointment's bad. If you don't expect much, you can't be disappointed. Well, which is it? I do have an answer. But I'm curious to know what you think. What do you think? How would you resolve it? Because this is a real dilemma, Dana, right? I mean, you really can see, can you see both sides of the argument? Well, what's the answer? What do you think? Tell me your name? Brittany, of course. Hi, Brittany. Okay, so Brittany's trying to have it both ways. So Brittany says you can have high standards, but they shouldn't be narrow. You should sort of have high standards, maybe generally high standards, but be aware of different ways that relationships can reach those high standards. Interesting idea, Brittany. Danielle?
Maybe it's important just that each partner, like their standards are similar to each other.
Oh, that's an interesting idea. Danielle says maybe it's a matching issue. It's not about whether you have high or low, but they have to be similar. If we both have high standards, then then we're both going to be okay. I can tell you that that's probably not true, because if you both have you're both disappointed. If you both have high expectations and they're both disappointed, well, that's two disappointed people is not better than one. Luke.
Have high standards, but keep them realistic.
Interesting. Well, I mean that is the answer. So that is the answer we came up with. Exactly that. I'm going to expand on that in a moment. But what are other thoughts? Melissa?
I think that the standards are different than expectations.
And they are.
And you can have standards, but if you're expecting them to be met and that's a requirement for you, then you will be less satisfied. But if high expectations can create disappointment if they're not met. So if you're looking at it with a different type of expectation, then you might be less likely to be disappointed.
So have high standards, but don't expect them to be met?
Not necessarily. Like you can have the high standards, but if they're not met, then based on that expectation, then you're going to be less disappointed.
Have high standards, but expect to be disappointed once in a while, and don't sweat about it. It's not so bad. It's not so bad. It's sort of consistent with Luke's position, which we'll get to in a moment. Is that Sabrina?
I'd say maybe not fully. You have standards, those might be like your minimum, like I need the person to do this way. Then you have, it's talking about the ideal.
Ah.
You need at least some standards. You don't want to be with someone who's completely inadequate for what you desire. But
Ah.
I have ideals that are always met.
That's not bad. So have high ideals. Shoot for the sky, but make your standards for what you'd settle for. So you're like, well, I'm willing to settle for something less than my ideal, but I do have high ideals. Interesting idea. Kind of also sort of consistent, but that's a very nice way of putting it. Other thoughts? Other thoughts? I didn't mean to shut down the discussion. Heidi? I didn't follow all that. So let me see. So Heidi's saying that, say it again. Tell me again.
When you're obsessing about, like, say you're with someone and you're obsessing, do they fall into my standards or my expectations? Let's say some of them are mostly yes, and then you're unhappy. Well, then you find someone that's lower in your ideal or standards, but you know that they're lower and you still obsess that they're lower. You actually might be unhappy even if you settle there.
So now I think I get Heidi's point. Heidi is saying that basically paying too much attention to this, about thinking too hard about these issues in your own relationships probably isn't a good thing. Heidi's saying, if you obsess about your own standards, whether they're being met, whether you're lowering them too high, you've already lost the game, according to Heidi. Do I get that? Am I summarizing you pretty well? And by the way, separate from this class, separate from my point I'm trying to make here, there's some evidence for that. People who are ruminating about the relationship too much are probably not the happiest people. Was there another point? Well, then let me... So a lot of these ideas actually are consistent with Luke's, what I thought very elegant, what I thought was elegant, since it's exactly what we said, as formulation, which is you should have the highest standards and expectations that are realistic for you. So what does that mean? Then that raises a question for us. What does it mean to be realistic? Well, the idea would be that you should know what's reasonable to expect, and then expect the best within what's reasonable. So what makes the dysfunctional beliefs that we were talking about earlier dysfunctional is that each of those beliefs are so extreme that they are unreasonable and guaranteed not to be met. So for example, the idea that disagreement is destructive, there can be no disagreement between us. Well, that's not reasonable, because there absolutely will be disagreement every time. That's an unreasonably high expectation. David? It's a good question. And it was our question when we decided to try to study this. We wanted, because the implication of this, according to Luke, is if you have to have realistically high expectations, what's realistic for my relationship may be different than what's realistic for your relationship. So the advice, Dana, to give to people might not be one size fits all. It might depend on what the status of your relationship is. So here's how we measured it, David. We used our videotapes. We got our newlyweds into the lab, Jim McNulty, now at University of Tennessee, and myself. We brought the newlyweds into the lab, and we videotaped them talking about a problem, as I've discussed with you last week. And we had the raters now evaluate, so we wanted now an objective sense of whether people were good or bad at dealing with their problems. And we had observers who could agree with each other that couple is being pretty effective and that couple isn't being effective. Early in the relationship, as newlyweds, within 6 months of marriage. And then we also asked these same exact newlyweds to tell us about their expectations for the relationship. Do you expect you're going to do well? Do you expect you're going to be happy a lot of the time, most of the time? Do you expect your partner will be there for you when you need always? We had a measure of expectations where some people scored really high. They had super high expectations for their relationship. They thought they were going to have a fulfilling, satisfying, low conflict, high passion relationship. Other people, even as newlyweds, had lower expectations. They were saying, look, we're married, but I'm not expecting it to be wine and roses all the time. I'm not expecting that we won't fight. I'm expecting that there are going to be some difficult times. So there's a wide range of expectations. And what we want to know is, who does the best over time? Who declines the most? And we know that over time, most relationships decline. The question is, who declines the most? So we sort of divided up the data so we could look at 4 groups. The people who were, according to the objective raters, doing a good job at resolving conflict. And we divided them, and we separated them from the people who, according to the raters, were doing the least good job, not doing a good job resolving conflict. And then we divided both of those groups into the people who had the highest expectations and the people who had the lowest expectations. Who do you want to be? What's going to be the positive, what's going to be the best situation for you in terms of your expectations? Let me put it another way. Let me ask you this question, and I do want someone to answer it. When is it best to have high expectations? Okay, Luke? When they're nice. Stay with what works. And in this case, they're realistic to the extent that, yes? Okay? So when, in this study, when is it realistic, Sabrina? Yes. If you have good communication with your partner, that's the time to have high expectations. You've got the tools, now reach for the stars. When is it good to have low expectations? When you're not so good at communicating with your partner. If you have some kind of realistic sense that, you know what, we don't do this communication thing that well, might be a good time to lower your expectations. You don't want lower expectations if you've got the tools. By the way, did we find evidence for this? Yes. So this is a negative slope. So this was the amount of decline for people who had less negative behavior. In other words, they're doing pretty well. They don't have a lot of negative behavior, and they have positive expectancies. So the people that's the situation that Sabrina was just describing. They're communicating well, and they expect the best. They decline, negative 0.4. But the people who had less positive expectancies, but also behaved well, declined more. So check out these two columns. These two columns say that these people, the people in the red group, hey, they communicate well. They might have a realistic chance of doing quite well since they communicate effectively, but they don't expect to, and indeed they don't. They don't do as well as perhaps they might have had they maybe tried a little bit harder. Danielle.
For couples that don't go to therapy or don't really have anybody else rating how well they communicate, how good are people at knowing how well they communicate?
That's a good question. It's a very good question. We know that people are not very good at telling us about the specifics of their behavior. People are not very good at telling us specifically whether they fought 2 times last week or 6 times last week. But evaluating how people feel after an interaction, I'm guessing people are probably pretty good at that. But it's just, I can only speculate as a researcher. That how effective is your communication? I might measure that by saying, how good do you feel when you're done? We didn't do that this time, but this time we really wanted to be totally as objective as we could. In fact, our objective ratings are correlated significantly, but not that highly, with people's own evaluations of their interactions. So when people communicate well, they don't have a lot of negative behavior. The people with the high expectations did better than the people with the low expectations. But, as you might imagine, it flipped around for the people who had negative behavior. You see this, Luke? The people who are not communicating well, Danielle, for whatever reason, in this case it was our perceptions, but probably they might have also said, yeah, well, we don't communicate that well. If you don't communicate well, and you say, but everything's going to be super forever, that's you. You are not following Luke's advice. You are not having that's not a realistic expectation. If you have negative behavior, this is not a realistic expectation. But if you've got negative behavior, and you have moderate expectations, and you say, hey, things are going to be rough for us. Protection. You don't start out as high as those people, but you don't decline as much either. Moral of the story. Now, one size does not fit all. Luke's point of view is very good. What's a healthy way to think about your relationship? Have expectations that are as high as they can be within the realistic constraints of your relationship. Class dismissed.
You got a question?
Yeah.